but humans are they're pretty innovative, right? And eventually, we did figure out how to change ourselves, or at least to change our social institutions. And what you'll see is in the progressive era, which is around 1890 to 1910, there's this huge wave of new civic institutions coming into being, all mostly from the bottom up. And if you look at this list, I mean, this is like a roll call of 20th century civic society in America. Okay, now some of these were meant to address specific issues, but a lot of them, like these, the social clubs, the Elks, you know, the Eagles, that sort of thing, they were really just they were just social capital banks. You came in, you paid your membership dues, and you got your connections, or you got even more tangible things like healthcare. A lot of these would actually, their members got sick, they would pay for your healthcare. If you died, they would pay for your funeral. They would make sure that your kids got educated. This is before the welfare state, of course. Well, these institutions were much better calibrated to the industrial society we found ourselves in. And so, you know, armed with these institutions, social capital kept building and building, finally reaching a climax in World War II, which I think anyone can tell you was the most civically engaged time in America in the whole 20th century, largely because of the shared adversity of the war. And what's so interesting about the war is not only was everyone mobilized, but even the mobilizing and the administration of it all was really largely being done by volunteers. There were about 4,000 civilian defense volunteer offices across the country. They were all run by the junior leagues. So all the scrap drives, victory gardens, selling the war bonds, these were all volunteers doing this. And it also actually saw a perceived and an actual rise in economic equality, which was interesting. So that brings us back to 1950, right, where we started. Now, if you look at this, you'll notice that I have somewhat speculatively filled this in up to 2050, right? I don't actually have a crystal ball, of course, but, and I don't have any statistical data on what's happened to social capital in the last decade. But we've got some interesting looking ingredients here. We've got a new generational shift. Okay, the millennials are coming of age. The media likes to call them the new civic generation. They like to talk about the end of the culture wars. Really interesting thing happened with the internet. When that started, we thought it was going to be the most anti-social technology of all, right? Remember virtual reality? We were all just going to spend all of our time locked away in this abstract world, never leaving the house. That's not really what happened, right? It turned out it was more compelling to shrink the internet into a little Swiss Army knife that you just carry around with you to get done tasks and help you with your socializing in the real world. Now, on top of all of that, talk about shared adversity. Well, we've got peak oil, right? I mean, if that's not going to put us on a war footing, I don't know what is. And also something that I observed, I wanted to build a graph of this and really show you, but I ran out of time. But I really think we're seeing an increasing amount of overlap between sort of the community building groups and environmental groups. We're really starting to see that that how we live and how we treat the planet are two sides of the same coin. So I think you can say the time is ripe for this. Okay, so there's one group in particular I want to talk about. This is where I get to do my shameless plug for transition. It's the Transition Towns movement. Okay, it was started in England in a town called Totnes. They officially unleashed themselves or kicked off as a transition town in September 2006, and it spread virally since then. And today there's about 280 official transition towns worldwide, mostly in the UK and the US. Okay, so what is a transition town? Well, on paper, it's a community that's engaged in a proactive, holistic plan for resilience and energy descent. And when we say community, we mean a real community that's rich in social capital and that's involving the residents and the businesses and the local government. When we say holistic, it means they're addressing all the implications of peak oil, which primarily means we have to relocalize our food supply, our energy supply, and to some extent our goods and services, and of course the skills to make said goods and services. Most important, though, is the proactive part. Okay? This is not about how we can avoid energy descent. It's about how we can accomplish energy descent while there's still time to do it on our own terms. Okay? And in particular, okay, it's about taking control of the narrative, okay? The narrative of change, right? So when you hear people talking about a techno fix or the market will solve it, or you hear people talk about the collapse of civilization, okay, those are all really, what they're all really doing is they're battling for the narrative of how what we're gonna expect to have happen over the coming decades, okay? So Transition Town is very key. It's a key element of this. It's a cornerstone that we're doing positive visioning by imagining a way to be enthusiastic about a low energy future. So low energy but high satisfaction, right? Okay, now this is where when it asked me, yeah, that's great, but what have these transition towns actually been doing this whole time, right? Well, like I said, it's a young movement, and awareness of peak oil, even in a quote-unquote transition town, is not really that widespread. So a lot of it, they're just going around talking to people. They're holding open space meetings, which are essentially like community brainstorming. They're forming what they call heart and soul groups, which is essentially like peak oil therapy, you know, sort of like peak oil, I'm addicted to oil or oil withdrawal, or just going through the trauma of realizing, you know, post-oil stress syndrome or something. They're interviewing the town elders about their lifestyles in a time where things were more localized. And they're conducting visioning exercises. One thing that seems to be really popular is constructing a virtual newspaper from the future, you know, just sort of talking about the ordinary goings-on of the town after we've made what's presumed to be a successful transition to a low-energy lifestyle. Physically, food is the low-hanging fruit, no pun intended. There's a lot of focus on food. There's a lot of focus on, again, reskilling people to just all the sort of homesteading things that we used to know how to make and don't anymore. And then a lot of various ways to share resources in the town more efficiently, whether it's ride sharing or making a tool library or finding out you know, frameworks in which neighbors can borrow or swap things from each other, setting up businesses to repair and remanufacture things instead of everyone just throwing them away. And then some of the more ambitious ones have been local currencies. And then in California, where of course water is the elephant in the room, I know gray water is a big hot topic. So that just gives you an idea of what these towns have actually started doing so far. So speaking of California, we've got over a dozen official towns. There's been more since I made this list. I think Albany and Richmond over the East Bay just did it. And San Francisco is actually a recent official town. We got official status in January. And then there's dozens and dozens of towns which are mulling, which basically means there's people there who would like to start a transition town and are trying to get to the sort of the critical mass. So what are we doing in transition in San Francisco? Well, like I said, this spread virally through rural England very successfully. Partly because what works for one town in rural England is going to work pretty well for the next town, and it's pretty obvious what's a town and what's not. So one town, one initiative, it spreads really easily. In the Bay Area, like I said, right, community scale, we're talking the inner sunset. That's the community, right? So at some point, the transition tactics have to happen at a neighborhood level, not at a city level. But then we have to ask ourselves, how self-reliant can a neighborhood be? I mean, the inner sunset is not going to be able to grow all its own food, right? And San Francisco is probably not going to be able to grow all its own food. And with water being unequally distributed in California, some of those issues are going to require regional coordination, even though the community organizing has to happen at a community level, at the neighborhood level. Engagement, well, this is a homegrown movement in England, right? No one walked in and told them to do this. They're just deeply attached to their towns, and they want the towns to continue to be viable in the near future. So it's just a very pragmatic thing for them. The Bay Area, of course, well, in America in general, we've got less deeply rooted populations, so getting the community engagement is the first hurdle. And then, of course, the Bay Area is saturated with activism, right? Which is, you know, both a blessing and a curse. A lot of good ideas going out there. A lot of people who are already well aware of peak oil and doing transitioning, they're just not doing it with a capital T, right? But you know, it's more of a struggle to make yourself heard in this town. I mean, let's put it this way: you put up a transition poster on the flyer in one of these British towns, it gets a lot more attention than you put it over here on Inner Sunset next to all the other stuff, right? Or let alone in the Haight or something. And finally, one of the biggest challenges is visioning, right? Now, I want to be very clear that, you know, turning back the clock is not a desirable or a practical solution to peak oil. However, these towns that have been around for centuries before oil, all you have to do is open the history books to start getting a lot of really useful ideas to start from. In the Bay Area, we've never had I mean, California's never been a no-growth or a deindustrial state ever since we got here, which was the gold rush. Okay, that's fair. But the population and the way the population was distributed then was so different that the population distribution we have now, you know, we have to question whether some of these settlements can even, you know, are even in the right place at all.